Welcome to the ASEAN Wonk podcast, where we bring you expert insights and regional perspectives on Southeast Asia and Indo-Pacific geopolitics and geoeconomics. I'm your host, Dr. Prashant Paramaswaran. If you haven't already, do subscribe to the ASEAN Wonk platform at www.aseanwonk.com. Our guest today is Dr. Michael Green. He's formerly at the National Security Council on Asia Policy, and now is the CEO of the U.S. Study Center at the University of Sydney. We'll start our conversation talking about contemporary U.S. Asia policy dynamics, and we'll go through a number of other subjects, including what we can expect with respect to future U.S. policy in the region, as well as some of the policy dynamics we might expect with upcoming midterm elections later this year as well. So welcome to the podcast, Mike, and let's start, if we could, on U.S. Asia strategy more generally. With the caveat, of course, that we're in the midst of a war with Iran and a president who has some of the greatest latitude we've seen in terms of policymaking in recent history. You've written what I would say is the most extensive book on the subject of U.S. Asia strategy, By More Than Providence. And that looks at U.S. Asia strategy even before, actually, the founding of the United States, all the way up to some of the contemporary dynamics that we're sort of talking about. But I guess with the current administration, and particularly the second administration of U.S. President Donald Trump, there's a lot of focus on some of the personalistic dynamics. I'm hoping that we can get a little bit beyond that and talk a little bit more about some of the structural realities and some of the measures of continuity and change. If you talk to administration officials, they point out that there are still some gains and signs of continuity in terms of security networking with Australia, Japan, and the Philippines. And some of the things that we saw in the first Trump administration, for example, of the Development Finance Corporation, some of the rebranded minilaterals like Pax Silica, for example, in some of these sectors. So there's a case to be made there. But at the same time, if you look at some of the big, broader trends in terms of trade, in terms of values, and in terms of some of the aspects of the policy ecosystem, there's some really dramatic change there as well. So having long been a professor yourself as well, and then also written a book on this subject, how would you sort of grade the administration's approach to Asia so far?
Well, thanks, Prashant. It's great to be an honorary ASEAN Wonk for an hour and to spend time with a CSIS alum. How would I grade them? Gosh, I would send them to the school counselor for examination is the honest answer. But I wouldn't expel them from school because there are, as you suggest, some real points of continuity. And we're in this strange situation where there has perhaps never been as much consensus on Asia, the importance of Asia, the nature of the strategic challenge from China, and the criticality of alliances. There hasn't been this much consensus. And this consensus has been around for 8-10 years now, in the whole post-war era, but we haven't had a president who is as disinterested or almost hostile to that consensus as we have with Donald Trump. So when my book, By More Than Providence, came out, it was 2017, so it was the first year of the Trump administration, and the reviews were all generally very good, but some reviewers said, well, that's been a fine explanation for the last 240 years, but now that Donald Trump is president, America doesn't have a foreign policy or strategy anymore. And, actually in the first Trump administration, they did. The national security strategy put out by the Trump administration was the first to say that our focus has got to be on strategic competition with China and with Russia. Officials like Steve Biegun at State, Matt Pottinger at the NSC, General Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, and a lot of others really built a kind of balance of power, what my old boss Condoleezza Rice used to call a balance of power that favors freedom, upgrading the Quad, strengthening the alliance with Japan. And the first Trump term gets reasonably high marks in places like Tokyo and the Philippines. And then the Biden administration continued a lot of it. The Quad, for example, which was made a foreign ministers summit by Secretary Mike Pompeo, the Biden administration made it a summit, like a presidential level summit. They didn't undo basically anything that the Trump administration done in Asia. But then the second Trump administration turned out to be much more of a departure from that trend. And a lot of it is because President Trump himself clearly believes that he now has the authority and the experience and maybe even the mission to do big things. And what those big things are, it kind of changes from day to day. And so, he's not strategic at all. He's extremely tactical. It's day to day. He's interested in enhancing his ways and means, his reputation, his power, his tools. But what for is never clear. And I don't buy these arguments that he believes in spheres of influence or that we are in a neo-monarchical. I think that's just basically kind of the vibe or the mood, or as he puts it, his gut on any given day. So that makes it very hard to sustain strategy. And he's appointed a lot of people who frankly think that the enemy of America is within. That's not the best frame of mind to deal with strategic competition from without. So there's a lot more uncertainty. But underneath it all, as you suggested in your intro, if you look at congressional views, including Republicans, if you look at public opinion, if you look at military alliances in Asia, there's far more continuity than change underneath the surface. And we can talk about how much the surface matters. It matters. But I don't see, to wrap up this history, I don't see us on a new trajectory. I see us in a period of incredible turbulence, but not a fundamental change in the way that the American system is going to be viewing competition in Asia for the coming decades.
So another point, Mike, that you kind of referenced earlier is that I think there is some sort of chatter about this sort of U.S. episode with respect to Iran in terms of thinking about this as, this is kind of, we've seen this playbook before, with respect to the war on terrorism, for example, and the Bush administration, which you were in as well. I guess my issue with that is that in the last 20 years, the world has changed pretty fundamentally. We've had, a war in Ukraine, for example, that has kind of reinforced the importance of connectivity between different regions, rather than this notion that we were in the Obama administration, which is, sort of a pivot or rebalance to Asia. And in fact, some of the advocates of the pivot, including Kurt Campbell, have actually admitted that, these realities are actually much more sophisticated relative to where they were 20 years ago. And in fact, the U.S. position is also quite different. I mean, the U.S., in terms of hydrocarbons, for example, its position is quite different from where it was 20 years ago. And also, China and the China challenge is a much more fundamental challenge today than it was 20 years ago as well. So how would you sort of think about this notion of the sort of evolution from the pivot and rebalance, where we were, sort of the conversation 15 to 20 years ago, to where we are at now, where we're seeing a lot more focus on, hemispheric homeland concerns. But I guess, like, when I look back further at U.S. history, whether it's the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Monroe Doctrine, these things are not exactly new. It seems like a rebalancing of U.S. interests with respect to Asia relative to the rest of the world.
Yeah, none of this is new in a way. I started my book, By More Than Providence, in 1783, because that's when Thomas Jefferson sent a letter to the commander of U.S. forces in the frontier, which was somewhere in Pennsylvania at the time, warning that our spies in London had learned that the British were planning an expedition across Canada to find a fast route to the Pacific Northwest and access to the Pacific Ocean. And Jefferson said to Colonel Clark, we need to find a way to get there first, which of course was a big part of the Lewis and Clark expedition. It was geopolitical. So geopolitics is in the American DNA, even if it's sloppy and contested and inconsistent. I was actually surprised to find that when I did my research. What was going to be a 2-year project became a 7-year project because there's so much rich strategic debate about the Pacific in Congress, in congressional hearings, among men of letters. And so that's one of the reasons, frankly, why I think we have to look at the Trump era not as a new, unprecedented trajectory in American foreign policy, but a period of turbulence, and how much damage the turbulence does, we can discuss. I don't think I can't remember. I don't think I put this in my book. I use it in class, but there's a great cartoon by Herb Block, the famous Washington Post cartoonist. You're old enough, and Washingtonians, you probably saw Herb Block. But he had a cartoon in the 1940s during World War II, and it shows General MacArthur, who commanded in the Far East, meeting with General Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the Army. And MacArthur has brought in a globe of the world to discuss strategy, and the globe is a cube, and East Asia's on top. And Marshall says, well, you know, General, here we prefer to use a round globe. And it was making fun of the fact that MacArthur wanted everything in North Africa and Europe, you know, put in second place or dropped to pivot military resources to the Pacific. And I do that at Georgetown in my class because I don't want people who major in Asian studies to think that good Asia strategy is neglecting the rest of the world, and especially for the US, which is a global power, a two-ocean power, and all the rest. And so I was in the White House on 9/11. I was in the White House during Afghanistan and Iraq. I did not go into meetings and say, we can't be doing any of this. We've got to focus on Asia. I thought, how do we, and I was hardly alone in this, Rich Armitage and many others, but how do we, you know, basically take advantage of this crisis to strengthen our alliances and partnerships in Asia? And I think sometimes advocates of Asia strategy think we can hit pause on the Middle East or on Europe, but especially on the Middle East, because it's such a quagmire. It's like that movie On the Waterfront. You keep trying to get out and you get pulled back in. But as Lee Kuan Yew said, Americans think, you know, geopolitics is a video game and you can hit pause in one part of the world and then come back and nothing will have happened while you're dealing with another. And Lee Kuan Yew actually recognized the U.S. in Singapore's and Asia's interests had to tend to security in the Middle East, had to tend to security in Europe. So I'm not an advocate of just ignoring Iran. And there's a lot, we can talk about it if you want, there's a lot, obviously, that the Trump administration did wrong with the Iran war in terms of their assumptions, poor planning, complete disregard for allies, and for the Congress and the American public. It's a pretty long list. But the underlying challenge from Iran was not created by Donald Trump. The missile program in particular was potentially heading towards 10,000 ballistic missiles in a few years. Unacceptable. So you can't just hit pause in the Middle East and hope everything will be fine. It's going to take some level of resources. Now, maybe more resources than we needed because of the way the war's been prosecuted, we'll see. But you have to have an Asia strategy within a global strategy. I don't know if you want me to talk more about Trump's lack of strategy or what we see as continuity, but obviously one big feature of his second term is going to be Iran, and it's undoing his presidency. You can see it in public opinion in the fights in MAGA. The effect on Asia is not, you know, people who say that he's Bismarck and this is brilliant are wrong, obviously, but people who say this is a complete destruction of our interest in Asia are also wrong. It's a mixed picture, and I think you have to be balanced in how you look at it.
And I guess one of the things that you mentioned with respect to MacArthur, for example, it is the conversation around the defense perimeter and how the United States is kind of looking at its worldview and its vision for the region. And I guess, you know, some of the chatter around sort of the narrowing of the administration's approach to the first island chain, for example, and the implications for, if you're looking at, say, Vietnam, the South China Sea, for example, I guess, you know, there are some elements of change there and concern, which I understand. There are also some elements of continuity that I see as well, which is, you know, in the last couple of administrations, the Philippines has really cemented its role in terms of the U.S. security architecture, right, around the alliances, but also Guam, Hawaii, and so on and so forth with respect to Japan, Australia. The networking there is pretty intense. So I guess, what's your view on this sort of notion of the defense perimeter and the forward defense line relative to what we've seen in other periods in history, including MacArthur, the Korean War, and so on and so forth? Is it as much of a change, or do you see more continuity there with respect to the security aspect?
Drawing your defense perimeter, put another way, where you're willing to fight or risk war, is one of the hardest things in grand strategy. And in my book, By More Than Providence, it's a conundrum for American strategists for 250 years. In the book I wrote after that on Japan's grand strategy called Line of Advantage, it's a conundrum. Where do you draw the line? Where do you decide you're going to take risk? John Lewis Gaddis, in his book on strategy, says you need the discipline to sit inside the castle walls and listen to the villagers being burned alive, or something like that. He's obviously an advocate of clear defensive perimeters and being disciplined. And one of my old bosses, Steve Hadley, used to say, if you keep drawing red lines and you keep, and you don't defend them, you end up creating a red carpet. I love that line. And so it's very, very tricky. I think one problem U.S. strategists make sometimes is, to quote Homer Simpson, the great geopolitical thinker, sometimes they make a mistake of saying the loud part soft and the soft part loud. So when Dean Acheson in January 1950, after a review within the State Department of how to protect our interests and contain communism after the fall of China to Mao, mainland China to Mao, decided, well, don't worry. It was a political thing as much as it was strategic for the Democrats. But he said, don't worry, we've got this very strong defensive line with the first island chain, which was old thinking in American geopolitics. And he had that famous line between Japan and Korea in January 1950, which was a red carpet. It was an invitation to Mao, Stalin, and Kim Il-sung to test containment and allow Kim Il-sung to attack in 6 months later, June 1950. That was a mistake, to draw that defensive perimeter so clearly. Of course, in the Vietnam War, you had the flip problem, which is they didn't know where the defensive perimeter was, and they kept expanding. So, the strategy is, grand strategy or strategy is basically about reconciling two mutually contradictory goals. If you didn't have mutually contradictory goals, you wouldn't need to think about it. You just pursue your interests, but sometimes the goals compete. But I do think we are guilty in the United States sometimes of drawing the line too crisply, too clearly sometimes, and too much. So to give you more recent examples, the national defense strategy that came out, it was a dog's breakfast, as they say in Australia. It had all kinds of stuff in it. Some of it was ridiculous, but it did have a very clear and very historic focus on, as you said, on defending the first and second island chain in the Western Pacific. And but it was very reductionist. And this sort of follows Bridge Colby's thinking about Taiwan being the major central front. It was very reductionist. So everything's about Taiwan. And this is also a mistake because the defense of Taiwan is not just, and certainly not in the first instance, about military deterrence in North Asia and in the first island chain. I mean, that's absolutely core to the strategy. But Beijing's strategy is to win without fighting. So if you overly focus on the military deterrence piece, which is critical, but if that's all you're worried about, and you neglect, for example, diplomacy and development in Southeast Asia, or the transatlantic alliance, and the flavor of the national defense strategy in Bridges' thinking is he's a smart guy, and he's very focused on the core problem. He's worried about U.S. resources, but the danger of being overly reductionist and drawing a very clear line around what you're willing to fight for too much is you end up ceding in phase zero in peacetime strategic influence in Southeast Asia that allows China to flank you from the south with their own power projection, or prevent U.S. access to the archipelagic southern flank, which is critical for access basing overflight and dealing with a PLA campaign strategy that's the entire first and island, second island chain. And it's not a simple matter of deterrence, as you know well from your work. It's much more complicated. It's about development, it's about diplomacy, it's about soft power, it's about partnering with Australia, Japan, and others. It's not a kind of John Mearsheimer simple war and peace, black and white issue. It's complex, and if you get it wrong, you make it easier for China to fight without winning. And in a similar way, the transatlantic relationship. it is way too reductionist to say the central problem we have, the pacing threat, is dealing with the PLA on the Taiwan contingency, so we don't have time for Europe. And then to gratuitously sort of beat up the Europeans and tell them we don't want your ships in Asia life's not that simple. And strategy is not that simple. And Beijing would love to have Europe remain neutral, NATO remain neutral in a Taiwan contingency. And it's not whether, the order of battle changes because the Dutch send a frigate. It's about the geopolitical dissuasion effect, the geopolitical cost imposition that NATO can impose on China. And so, like losing interest in the IP4, the Australia, Japan, Korea, New Zealand summits with NATO, gratuitously fighting with Europe, especially right now, it's just an on-site goal. And so, yes, the folks. I'm, as a historian and a geography nut, I love the focus on the first and second island chain. It's absolutely right, but don't reduce the whole strategic problem to the military equation in the first island chain. Got to get that right, but if you get only that right, you lose anyway. So kind of a long answer, but a strategy, the famous DIME construct, you need diplomacy, intelligence, information, military tools, and economic. And I think part of the problem, there is continuity for sure on the military side, for sure, we can talk about it. But the DIME construct overall, we're not performing on the D and the I and the E in Asia. We're doing a lot of good stuff on the M. And there's a lot of continuity, which is why the alliances will survive. But in terms of strategic competition, we are not using our toolkit fully.
And on that, Mike, so just looking a little bit ahead of this administration, the sort of conversation that we will get to with as the midterms loom closer, diplomats and officials from the region will be asking, including in allied capitals, which is, how do we think about this question of Trumpism after Trump in terms of U.S. Asia policy, and what is that going to look like in terms of that sort of new bipartisan consensus around strategic competition, China, but also that DIME construct that you mentioned, and the very difficult balance that policymakers have to make between, the security and military inroads where the United States has always led, and the difficulties on the economic, diplomatic, and informational aspects that we've seen?
Well,